May 1940. The air above the English Channel trembled with smoke and fear. On the deck of HMS Kelvin, Captain William Tennant stood motionless, his face darkened by soot, his uniform stiff with salt and oil. Behind him, the sea hissed with the dying echoes of Luftwaffe raids. Before him, the coast of France was burning. Dunkirk, a name then known to few, was being swallowed by fire and desperation. The beaches were a chaos of men, soldiers knee-deep in the tide, rifles abandoned, eyes fixed on the horizon that promised salvation and doom in equal measure. Each plume of smoke rising from the shoreline carried the weight of a nation's disbelief. Britain's proud expeditionary force, the beating heart of its continental hope, had been driven to the sea. Columns of troops had been shattered by German tanks cutting through the Ardennes. Whole divisions were now trapped between the steel of the Wehrmacht and the cold, indifferent water of the Channel. Tennant, watching through the haze, understood the scale of the tragedy and the enormity of his task. The Kelvin rolled gently with the swell, but the captain's thoughts were sharp and still. He had spent years in the Royal Navy's quiet routines, drills, discipline, the long patience of peacetime command. Now those habits became his armor. Where others saw chaos, Tennant saw order to be restored. Where others felt fear, he felt duty. Behind the smoke, beyond the panic, was something Britain had not yet admitted to itself. The possibility of total defeat. And in that shadow, Tennant's story would begin. Down below, the beaches of Dunkirk stretched for miles, vast, flat, and merciless. Tens of thousands of British soldiers crowded together in the sand, waiting for ships that might never come. They were exhausted, hungry, and stripped of illusion. Some knelt in prayer. Others stared silently toward the faint outline of England across the water, as if willing it closer. The sea itself seemed complicit, rolling with slow indifference under the weight of their desperation. Through the smoke, German artillery thundered. Each detonation tore at the shoreline, flinging sand and shrapnel into the air. Bodies lay where they fell. Young men from Yorkshire, Glasgow, Cardiff, who days earlier had believed they were part of an invincible army. Above them, the Luftwaffe circled, striking without mercy. The smell of burning oil and cordite hung thick in the air, a reminder that time was running out. For Tennant, every moment lost meant another company was doomed. From the bridge of the Kelvin, he could see the harbor, shattered cranes, collapsed quays, and the great wooden mole stretching out into the tide. It was there, amid the wreckage, that he sensed the only hope of salvation. If ships could not reach the beaches, perhaps the men could reach the ships. It was a thought, not yet a plan, but it lodged in his mind with the precision of a naval chart. To the untrained eye, Dunkirk was a graveyard. To Tennant, it was a challenge written in smoke and flame. Far away in London, Churchill's war cabinet debated the unthinkable. How to rescue an army cut off by land and sea. The Prime Minister demanded miracles, and the Admiralty turned to a man known not for bluster, but for calm resolve. William George Tennant, quiet, methodical, respected, was summoned to Dover. His task was brutally simple: coordinate the evacuation of every British soldier from the French coast. No one could yet see how that would be possible. But Tennant, a sailor to the bone, understood what others did not, that in war, success is not always found in victory, but in survival. As dusk fell over the Channel, the fires of Dunkirk glowed like a second sunset. The Kelvin drifted closer, joining a flotilla of destroyers that waited for orders. Overhead, tracer rounds streaked through the smoky sky, green and red like some grotesque aurora. The men on deck said little. They had seen enough to know that words could not lessen the fear. And yet, somewhere within that silence, a current of resolve began to stir, the kind that moves a nation when logic says it should collapse. Tennant turned from the rail, giving quiet orders to his crew. His face was calm, but his eyes were hollowed by fatigue. He knew what awaited them ashore: chaos without command, death without dignity. But he also knew that Britain's fate now rested not with generals or politicians, but with men like himself, practical men, willing to endure the unbearable to bring others home. The sea, once his ally, had become his battlefield. As the Kelvin cut through the black waters toward Dunkirk, the night swallowed the horizon. Somewhere beyond the smoke lay the stranded army, 338,000 souls clinging to hope. And among them, the first whispers of what history would later call a miracle. What Tennant could not yet know was that within the ruins of defeat, he was about to orchestrate one of the greatest rescues in human history. A moment when courage, discipline, and duty would defy annihilation itself. The fire on the horizon was not just the end of an army, but the beginning of a legend. The channel was still, deceptively calm, as if the sea itself were holding its breath before the coming storm. Behind the smoke and fire of Dunkirk lay a quieter story, one that had been years in the making. The story of a man and a navy, shaped by tradition, by restraint, and by the unspoken certainty that Britain, the island fortress, would always endure. Before the rescue, before the miracle, there had been a lifetime of preparation. Captain William George Tennant had not been bred for glory, but for duty. He was the kind of officer the Royal Navy seemed to produce effortlessly, reserved, unshowy, precise. His manner was calm, his speech deliberate, his gaze steady even under pressure. To his men, he was Tug Tennant, a nickname that carried more affection than familiarity. He believed in the old virtues of seamanship, discipline, order, and the quiet confidence that the sea, though cruel, could always be mastered by men who respected it. In that, he was the living image of a Britain that had ruled the waves for centuries, proud, competent, and quietly certain of its place in the world. But that world was changing. The interwar years had been an age of illusion, of treaties, diplomacy, and disarmament, of hope that the horror of the Great War would never return. Britain had watched the rise of fascism across Europe through a fog of disbelief. Even as Germany rebuilt its armies, the Admiralty clung to the faith that deterrence and decency would prevail. The fleet was reduced, the ships aged, and the empire, though vast, was fraying at its edges. Yet through these years, Tennant remained at sea, commanding cruisers, training young sailors, keeping alive the discipline that the peace had eroded. By 1939, when war came again, it was almost a relief, a terrible vindication of what men like Tennant had quietly feared. The Royal Navy was once more the nation's backbone, the shield between Britain and annihilation. Tennant took command of HMS Repulse, a battlecruiser of proud lineage, though built for an older kind of war. Its decks gleamed with peacetime polish, its crew still learning to think not in exercises, but in survival. Yet, in those first uneasy months, the phony war, Tennant's patience and composure stood out. Where others found restlessness, he found purpose. He had spent his life preparing for a crisis, and now it had come. Across the Channel, France was collapsing. The German Blitzkrieg moved like lightning, tanks and aircraft tearing through the Ardennes in a storm of mechanized fury that no one in London had imagined possible. Within weeks, the British Expeditionary Force, nearly 400,000 men, was trapped, its supply lines severed, its allies in retreat. The generals called it a strategic withdrawal. But those who had seen the truth called it what it was, a catastrophe. In Whitehall, maps changed daily. The red arrows of German advance pushed westward, inexorable, while the blue dots marking British divisions crowded ever closer to the sea. The War Office buzzed with disbelief. How could this have happened so quickly? How could an army of Europe's finest be outflanked and cornered? Amid the noise and blame, a few calm voices began to speak. Voices from the Navy, men who understood that wars are not lost in speeches, but in the failure to act. Among them was Tennant. He was recalled from his duties at sea and brought to Dover. It was there, in the shadow of the White Cliffs, that he was told of the plan that barely existed. A desperate attempt to evacuate an entire army across the Channel. The codename was Operation Dynamo. It was audacious, almost absurd in its scale. No Navy had ever attempted such a thing under fire. Yet Tennant, standing before Admiral Bertram Ramsay in the subterranean tunnels of Dover Castle, did not flinch. The task was immense, but his instincts were clear. Ships could be replaced. Men could not. Even then, he knew the truth no one wished to say aloud. The Royal Navy could not do it alone. The destroyers were too few, the transports too slow, the beaches too shallow. And yet, for all that, there was still belief. Belief in the endurance of British seamanship, in the courage of the ordinary sailor, in the stubborn refusal to surrender. Tennant was given the role of senior naval officer at Dunkirk, the man on the ground, or rather, the man in the surf. His mission? To bring them home. Outside, the wind rose over the Channel, carrying with it the faint sound of gunfire from across the water. The sea that separated Britain from Europe, once a symbol of safety, had become a barrier between life and death. The Admiralty began mustering every ship that could float: destroyers, trawlers, ferries, even pleasure craft. To Tennant, the scale was staggering. It would take coordination, faith, and the kind of composure that few men could summon under fire. For now, though, there was calm. The ships lay at anchor. The sky was clear. Britain still breathed in the illusion of time. Yet beneath the surface, every officer, every seaman, every soldier stranded in France could sense what was coming. The storm that had broken over Europe was now rolling toward the coast, unstoppable, unforgiving. In the days ahead, Tennant would face decisions that would test not only his skill, but his soul. The fate of hundreds of thousands would depend on a man who had never sought fame, never raised his voice, and never expected history to remember his name. But history was waiting for him now, just beyond the horizon. The illusion of control ended in the forests of the Ardennes. For weeks, the Allied command had believed the terrain impassable, too dense, too narrow for modern armor to pass through. But in a single devastating stroke, the German Blitzkrieg shattered that belief. Tanks rolled through the mist and the pines like steel phantoms, followed by columns of infantry moving with merciless speed. What had once been a line of defense became a corridor of ruin. Within days, France, the great fortress of Europe, was collapsing. On the roads leading north, the British Expeditionary Force was retreating in silence. Columns of soldiers trudged through mud and smoke, past the burned-out wreckage of lorries and abandoned guns. Civilians streamed alongside them, pushing carts, clutching children, staring blankly toward the sound of distant explosions. The sense of order that had defined the Allied campaign dissolved into panic. Commanders lost contact, maps became meaningless, and the great machine of war, that proud, polished instrument of empire, began to fall apart in real time. For the men trapped within it, the collapse was almost surreal. They had crossed the Channel as conquerors, expecting a short campaign. Now they were fugitives, hunted from the skies. The Luftwaffe owned the daylight. Every movement was marked by its scream. Convoys scattered as bombs tore through the roads. Columns vanished into flame. By the time the British reached the coast, they were no longer an army in formation, but a mass of survivors driven by instinct alone. It was in those same desperate days that Captain William Tennant received his summons. In Dover, deep within the tunnels of the castle overlooking the Channel, Admiral Bertram Ramsay had been given one of the most hopeless orders in naval history: to rescue the entire British Expeditionary Force. Ramsay needed a man on the ground, someone capable not just of command, but of calm. There could be no grand strategy, no elegant maneuver, only endurance and decision under fire. Ramsay chose Tennant. When Tennant arrived in Dover, the atmosphere was electric with fear. The Admiralty's operations room flickered with maps and telegrams, each one carrying new fragments of disaster. Calais was under siege. Boulogne had fallen. Dunkirk, a narrow pocket on the French coast, was all that remained. Through that single port lay the only hope of evacuation, but even that hope was fading fast. The Germans were closing in from the south and east, their artillery already in range. If Dunkirk fell, Britain would lose not just its army, but its future. Standing before Ramsay's desk, Tennant listened as the plan was outlined in measured tones. The codename was Operation Dynamo, named after the power generator that hummed in the tunnels where they stood. Its goal was simple: bring the soldiers home. But as Tennant studied the charts, he saw the truth beneath the optimism. The port was small, its waters shallow, the beaches wide and exposed. Large ships could not approach the shore. Smaller ones risked destruction from the air. The Royal Navy's resources were limited: destroyers, a few transports, and whatever civilian vessels could be found. To evacuate even 50,000 men would be a triumph. Yet, there were more than 400,000 trapped. Still, there was no hesitation in Tennant's voice. He had been trained to weigh odds, not surrender to them. "We'll get them out," he said simply, knowing that it was less a promise than a defiance. He left Dover that evening aboard HMS Wakeful, bound for Dunkirk, a city already under bombardment. As night fell over the Channel, the horizon pulsed with distant flashes of light. Each detonation was a reminder that time was running out. Across the Channel, the beaches were transforming into a vision of hell. Smoke from burning oil tanks drifted across the dunes, turning daylight to twilight. The sea was slick with debris, lifeboats, helmets, the bodies of men who had drowned trying to swim to the ships. Lines of soldiers stretched along the surf, waiting their turn, disciplined even in despair. To the west, the wooden mole, the long jetty stretching into the sea, remained intact. And it was there, Tennant realized, that salvation might lie. The mole was not meant for loading troops, but with luck and precision, destroyers could come alongside and take men directly from the pier. It would be dangerous, but it could work. Back in London, Churchill watched the disaster unfold with a grim, almost spiritual intensity. He understood that Dunkirk was more than a battle. It was a reckoning. The Empire's faith in its own invincibility had evaporated. If the army was lost, Britain's will to fight might vanish with it. Yet in the midst of despair, he also saw a chance to prove that the British character was not measured by victory, but by resilience. "We shall never surrender," he would later declare. But in those days, surrender seemed a practical inevitability. For Tennant, there was no time for rhetoric. As the Wakeful entered the harbour, he saw the reality of the situation. The harbour half destroyed, the quays cratered, the city burning. French troops fought on the outskirts, holding off the German advance for a few more precious hours. Everywhere, men looked to the sea, that ancient, uncertain ally of Britain. Tennant began immediately, establishing communications, directing ships, and sending urgent reports back to Dover. He knew the task was almost impossible, but he also knew something the generals had forgotten. The sea was not merely a barrier. In British hands, it could still be a bridge. The fall of France was now complete. Paris would soon be abandoned, and Europe would kneel before the Nazi tide. Yet in the north, at the edge of the continent, one man and one navy were preparing to defy annihilation. From this narrow stretch of sand and water, history would demand an answer. Could Britain save its army, and with it, its soul? The storm had arrived. The question was no longer whether Britain could endure, but whether it could survive the night. The fires of Dunkirk glowed like a dying sun as HMS Wakeful slipped through the smoke toward the harbour. The sea was crowded with wreckage, overturned barges, broken masts, the debris of a retreating army. Above, the Luftwaffe droned in circles, their silhouettes cutting through the haze. When Captain William Tennant stepped onto the mole for the first time, it was as though he had entered another world, a world on the edge of collapse. The sand was black with soot and oil, the air thick with cordite, the cries of the wounded mingling with the shriek of bombs. He paused for only a moment. Then, without ceremony, Tennant began to work. He was not there to witness history. He was there to defy it. As senior naval officer on the ground, he now commanded what little order could be salvaged from the chaos. Around him, soldiers and sailors looked for direction. Officers shouted into field radios that no longer worked. Somewhere inland, the Germans were advancing, their artillery creeping closer each hour. Yet Tennant's mind was steady. He could hear the rhythm of the sea beneath the noise, a rhythm he had known all his life, and in it, he found calm. The mole itself was little more than a narrow wooden pier, fragile and exposed, never designed for such a purpose. But Tennant saw in its long, narrow reach the only lifeline that could still function. Destroyers could not come close to the beaches without running aground, but the mole extended deep enough into the tide to allow them to berth. It was a sailor's intuition, not a strategist's, and it would save hundreds of thousands. He began directing ships alongside it, one after another, in an unbroken cycle that turned chaos into rhythm. The first night was a blur of noise and exhaustion. Under the glare of flares and tracer fire, destroyers pulled in and out, loading men as fast as they could climb. Soldiers stumbled aboard, some clutching rifles, others nothing at all. Many wept silently as they crossed the gangways. The decks filled quickly. Engines roared. Ships pushed back into the dark, bound for Dover. Each successful departure brought a brief flash of relief, then the process began again. Tennant, standing on the mole in the open air, directed it all with a calm that seemed almost unnatural. But calm did not mean peace. The Luftwaffe struck without mercy. Bombs fell in relentless waves, shattering quays, igniting oil tanks, sending columns of fire spiraling into the night. Each blast shook the pier beneath his boots. Ships that had just filled with men were torn apart within sight of safety. Wakeful herself was struck and sunk on her return voyage. Hundreds of soldiers lost in an instant. Tennant received the report in silence, his jaw tightening. He could not grieve, not yet. There was no time. The living still needed saving. By dawn, The beaches were a sea of khaki and desperation. Columns of men stretched for miles, waiting in the surf, their faces hollow from sleeplessness and fear. Some had waited 30 hours without food. Yet even in their exhaustion, discipline held. The British line did not break. The Navy's boats, destroyers, trawlers, ferries, anything that could float, came and went in a grim procession. Every man knew the risk. Every captain understood that each trip could be his last. Still, they came. On the mole, Tennant barely slept. He worked through the bombardments, through the rain and smoke, through the reports of advancing German armor. His notebook filled with ship names, timings, numbers, a record of salvation written in pencil amid the roar of war. He refused to leave the pier, even as enemy aircraft strafed it. His presence became a fixed point, a kind of moral anchor for the men around him. One witness later said, "He stood there like a statue, calm, certain, as if the shells were falling for someone else." As the evacuation continued, something extraordinary began to happen. Civilian vessels, fishing boats, lifeboats, ferries, and private yachts began appearing on the horizon. They came in 2s and 3s at first, then by the dozens. The little ships, as they would later be called, answered the Admiralty's call for help and braved the journey through mined waters and enemy fire to reach Dunkirk. To Tennant, the sight was almost biblical. A procession of small vessels coming through smoke and flame, drawn by duty, by patriotism, by love of their countrymen. They brought with them a kind of hope that no order could command. Still, the cost was staggering. Every hour, new reports arrived of ships lost, men drowned, boats set ablaze. The beaches were littered with corpses. The tide ran red in places where rafts had overturned. For every success, a dozen tragedies followed. Tennant watched it all, recording none of it, speaking little. His responsibility was immense, not just to the men before him, but to the very idea of Britain. If this evacuation failed, the war would end before it had truly begun. On the evening of the 4th day, as the sun set over the channel, Tennant allowed himself a single moment of reflection. The horizon was dotted with ships, some burning, some still moving, and beyond them, the faint outline of home. He thought of Dover, of the men at the Admiralty tracking the numbers, of Churchill pacing in his war room. He thought of the soldiers who would return, not as victors, but as survivors, and of what that would mean for a nation that had never known retreat. Then another explosion ripped through the air, and he turned back to his work. There would be time for reflection later. For now, there were still thousands to save. The mole shuddered beneath him as another destroyer came alongside. He raised his hand, signaling the next group forward. Methodical, unflinching, as though the chaos around him were only wind and tide. By the end of that night, tens of thousands had been rescued. Yet the task was far from over. The enemy was closing in, the air grew thick with smoke, and the sea itself seemed to turn against them. But the rhythm of evacuation, that desperate ballet of ships and men, continued. It was not victory, not yet, but it was endurance, and that, Tennant knew, was enough to keep hope alive. Dawn broke pale and uncertain over Dunkirk. The fires of the previous night still burned across the waterfront, painting the sky in shades of orange and ash. The sea was littered with wrecks and the bodies of men who had not made it home. The Royal Navy was exhausted, destroyers pocked with shrapnel, crews half asleep at their guns, captains running on courage and caffeine alone. Yet, despite their heroism, the arithmetic of salvation was merciless. Too many men, too few ships, too little time. Captain William Tennant stood once again on the mole, coat stiff with salt, eyes red from smoke and sleeplessness. His logbook told a grim truth. Even with round-the-clock operations, they could not save them all. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Every sortie cost ships and lives. When the Wakeful, the Grafton, and the Grenade were lost within hours of each other, Tennant felt the weight of futility pressing against his discipline. The sea that had always been Britain's shield was now its gauntlet. And yet, amid the despair, the tide began to shift, not by command, but by faith. It began quietly, almost invisibly. A fishing trawler from Ramsgate appeared first, its engine coughing against the wind. Its skipper a man who had never seen battle. Then came a Thames barge, its deck crowded with coiled ropes and volunteers in civilian coats. Within hours, more appeared. Ferries, motorboats, tugs, and pleasure craft, each flying the white ensign of improvisation. They had come because the Admiralty had asked, but more truthfully, because Britain had answered. By mid-morning, the horizon itself seemed alive with movement. From where Tennant stood, the line between sea and sky was broken by the silhouettes of hundreds of small vessels. They came in clusters, their wakes silver in the dawn light, a procession of ordinary courage. No one had ordered them to come. They simply did. Teachers, pub owners, shipwrights, and retired sailors, men who had spent their lives within sight of the coast, were now steering into a war zone, armed with little more than faith and fuel. The soldiers on the beach saw them first. At a distance, many thought they were imagining it. Small shapes bobbing in the haze, too small to be warships, too slow to be safe. But as they drew closer, disbelief turned to joy. "They're coming for us," one private whispered, as if afraid the words might break the spell. Some cheered, some cried, some simply stood in silence. The rescue had become something greater than an operation. It had become a revelation. For Tennant, watching from the mole, the sight was overwhelming. In those countless small hulls, he saw something Britain itself had forgotten: the unity of a people without distinction of class or rank. Admirals and fishermen were now partners in survival. The same water that had divided Britain from Europe now bound its people together on purpose. The Channel, once the boundary of the Empire, had become its soul. The Evacuation transformed into a living tapestry of courage. The destroyers and minesweepers continued their dangerous rotations, but now they were joined by motorboats darting between them like bees, plucking men from the shallows and ferrying them to the larger ships offshore. Civilians handed out tea and cigarettes to soldiers too shocked to speak. Some boats returned again and again through fire and shrapnel, refusing to stop even when holed by bullets. They came not for glory, but because it was the right thing to do. Many never returned. The Sundowner, Tamzine, Medway Queen, their names would later be remembered, but dozens more vanished into the smoke, sunk without record or witness. The sea claimed them silently, as it always had. Tennant watched their progress through binoculars, aware that each civilian ship represented not only bravery, but sacrifice. "We owe them everything," he noted briefly in his dispatch, his handwriting firm despite the tremor of exhaustion. By the 5th day, the miracle had begun to take shape. Against every calculation, more than 200,000 men had been saved. Some stumbled ashore in Dover, too dazed to speak, their boots leaving trails of sand on the quays. Others wept openly at the sight of English soil. The ports of southern England were overwhelmed, canteens filled with steaming tea, churches ringing bells, railway stations crowded with exhausted soldiers and volunteers offering blankets. Britain, for all its divisions, had found itself united again, not through triumph, but through mercy. Tennant, still in Dunkirk, refused to leave his post. The bombardments continued day and night, but he would not abandon the last men on the beaches. He worked until his voice cracked, his uniform scorched from near misses, his mind moving between calculation and prayer. To his officers, he seemed almost mechanical in his endurance. But those who caught his eye saw the fatigue of a man carrying a nation's conscience. He had witnessed courage in every form, from destroyer captains steering through flame to fishermen steering by faith alone. It was, he would later admit, a sight that burned itself into the soul. When the last light of that day faded over the sea, the horizon was still alive with movement. The smoke had thinned, and through it came the silhouettes of returning boats, battered, blackened, triumphant. They carried not victory, but something deeper, proof that Britain, even at its weakest, could still rise to an act of collective grace. Standing once more at the end of the mole, Tennant removed his cap and looked to the west. The air was cold, the tide relentless. Behind him, the ruins of Dunkirk smoldered. Before him, the Channel glittered faintly in the moonlight. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that salvation was possible, not because of strategy or rank or empire, but because ordinary people had refused to let their own fall. The little ships had changed everything. The evacuation was no longer a retreat, it was a resurrection. And as the tide drew out once more, carrying the last of the rescuers homeward, the thought settled quietly in Tennant's mind. This was not the end of Britain's story. It was the moment she remembered who she was. The final ships left Dunkirk under a shroud of silence. Smoke still coiled above the ruins, drifting across the grey water like the breath of something immense and dying. The guns had fallen quiet, not from mercy, but because there was no one left to fire at. For 10 relentless days and nights, the sea had borne witness to one of the greatest rescues in human history. Now, as the last boats turned for home, Dunkirk lay abandoned to its fate. What had begun as a desperate improvisation had ended as a miracle. And yet, beneath that triumph, there was a terrible stillness. Captain William Tennant stood on the deck of HMS Calcutta as it slipped from the harbor for the final time. Around him, the dawn revealed what the darkness had hidden. Wrecked ships half submerged in the shallows, tanks sunken like carcasses, the beaches strewn with abandoned rifles, boots, and broken helmets. The tide lapped gently over the remnants of an army's ordeal. To the untrained eye, it looked like defeat. To Tennant, it was something more complicated, a paradox of deliverance and loss that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the Calcutta crossed the channel, the captain remained silent. His crew, exhausted but alive, watched the horizon where England would soon appear. Somewhere beyond that grey line lay Dover, its harbour already overflowing with rescued men. They would be greeted as heroes, and rightly so. But Tennant, staring into the spray, could not feel the triumph. He saw instead the faces of those they could not save. The French rearguards still fighting on the perimeter, the wounded left in hospital tents, the bodies that would never be counted. He had done his duty, fulfilled it beyond expectation, and yet, as the engines hummed beneath his feet, he felt the emptiness of command. When he arrived in Dover, the scene was both overwhelming and unreal. The quays were alive with motion, stretcher bearers, nurses, dockhands, and civilians handing out tea and cigarettes. The rescued soldiers moved like ghosts through the mist, their eyes hollow, their uniforms stiff with salt. Some wept at the sight of the cliffs. Others simply stared into nothing, too numb to comprehend that they had survived. Church bells rang in distant towns, not in celebration, but in thanksgiving. Across Britain, the news spread like wildfire. 338,000 men had been saved. Against every prediction, an army had been plucked from annihilation. The newspapers called it the miracle of Dunkirk. Churchill, with his instinct for words that would outlive the moment, declared that wars were not won by evacuations. And yet, privately, even he marveled that so much had been achieved. It was Tennant's coordination, his refusal to abandon the mole, his mastery of chaos that had made it possible. His name, however, was barely mentioned. The nation needed symbols, not administrators. His reward was silence, and in that silence, he returned to duty. For Tennant, home offered no comfort. In his brief reports to the Admiralty, he described the success in measured factual tones, numbers, tonnage, hours. But in private, the weight of what he had seen pressed down like ballast. He had watched men drown within reach of safety, seen ships vanish in seconds, heard the cries of soldiers as the tide carried them away. He had stood on the mole through nights that seemed to stretch beyond time, wondering whether the next bombardment would end it all. Now, back on British soil, the noise of the guns was gone, but the silence was worse. That silence spread across the nation. France was gone. Europe lay in the grip of the Reich. Britain stood alone, battered, defiant, unbowed. The army that had escaped was alive, but it was unarmed and demoralized. Tanks and weapons had been left behind, munitions lost, allies scattered. The miracle had saved the men, but not the continent. Churchill's government prepared for invasion. The Home Guard was mobilized. Coastal defenses were reinforced with barbed wire and makeshift barricades. The Channel, once the path of rescue, now loomed as the front line of survival. In those weeks after Dunkirk, Tennant kept working, advising on naval logistics, overseeing convoys, ensuring the flow of men and equipment for what was to come. Yet privately, he carried the scars of command. To those who saw him, he seemed unchanged, quiet, capable, composed. But within, the memories churned, the faces in the smoke, the endless rhythm of ships arriving and departing, the moral exhaustion of watching others die so that others might live. He had witnessed the best and worst of humanity in the same breath. For Britain, Dunkirk became more than an event. It became a myth, a story told in pubs, in sermons, in newspapers, a story of defiance against despair. But myths demand simplicity, and Dunkirk was anything but simple. For every soldier who stepped ashore in Dover, another had fallen behind in France. For every cheer that rang out across England, there was the quiet grief of those who understood what had been lost. The British spirit had endured, but at a terrible cost. Tennant visited Portsmouth weeks later and stood alone on the dockside at dusk, watching the grey silhouettes of ships against the fading light. The channel was calm again, the air heavy with the scent of salt and rain. In that stillness, he thought not of the glory that others spoke of, but of duty, that quiet, relentless virtue that demanded everything and promised nothing. History would remember the miracle, it would forget the burden. But Tennant knew that deliverance and desolation were inseparable, that saving a nation did not mean saving oneself. As the sun sank beyond the horizon, the lights along the coast began to flicker out. One by one, in preparation for the blackout, Britain was alone in the dark now, an island of defiance surrounded by fire. And yet, somewhere within that darkness, the spirit that had risen from the beaches of Dunkirk still burned. Fragile, stubborn, unyielding. Years later, the beaches of Dunkirk lay quiet again, the tides smoothing the scars of war as if trying to forget. The sand that had once been blackened by oil and blood was now pale and clean, the sea gentle, the gulls indifferent. The world had moved on. Britain had fought through the long years of the war that followed, through the Blitz, through El Alamein, through Normandy, until victory finally came. But for those who had lived through those first desperate days of 1940, Dunkirk was never merely a chapter of the war. It was the moment when the country discovered itself anew, fragile, frightened, and yet unbroken. Captain William Tennant lived to see peace return. After Dunkirk, he continued to serve, later commanding the aircraft carrier Repulse and overseeing naval operations in distant seas. His professionalism never faltered, but something within him had changed. Those who knew him said he grew quieter still, more reflective, as though he carried with him the weight of those he had left behind on the beaches. There were no medals for what he had done at Dunkirk, no parades, no speeches. His name rarely appeared in newspapers. The world preferred simpler heroes. Churchill with his rhetoric, the soldiers with their bravery, the civilians with their courage. The man who had orchestrated the miracle was content to fade into the background, as if history itself had asked him to be silent. But silence does not erase truth. It only buries it until someone listens. In the Admiralty records, in letters, and in diaries, his presence is everywhere. The man who stood on the mole for 10 days, who coordinated hundreds of ships, who refused to leave until the last man was safe. His calm, his clarity, his endurance became the invisible backbone of what the world called a miracle. Without Tennant, there might have been no Dunkirk to mythologize at all. When the war ended, Britain stood exhausted, but undefeated. The empire it had once ruled was already beginning to fade, but something far more enduring had taken its place. A moral identity forged not from conquest, but from survival. The spirit of Dunkirk became a national myth, a touchstone of courage and defiance that outlived the war itself. It was told in classrooms and films, in the quiet pride of those who had been there, and in the unspoken understanding of those who had not. It became less a story of retreat than of resurrection, the moment when Britain, stripped of illusion, rediscovered its soul. Churchill's words would echo through generations. "We shall fight on the beaches." But behind those words lay the work of men like Tennant, the quiet professionals who turned rhetoric into reality. The mole at Dunkirk was no place for speeches. It was a place for endurance. And in that endurance, something profoundly British was revealed. The belief that even in defeat, dignity could be preserved. That leadership was not about glory, but about service. That courage could exist without reward. Tennant retired from the Navy in the years after the war, promoted to admiral, honored but uncelebrated. He lived simply, away from politics and ceremony. To those who met him, he seemed courteous, reserved, and entirely without vanity. When asked about Dunkirk, he would say little. "We did what was necessary," he once remarked, a sentence that held within it all the understatement of a generation that had seen too much. He died in 1958, aged 70, his passing marked by brief notices in the naval journals and a few quiet tributes from those who had known him. But history, like the sea he had served all his life, has a long memory. With each retelling, Dunkirk returned, in books, in broadcasts, in films. The names changed, the faces blurred, but the essence remained. A story of ordinary men doing the extraordinary. And beneath the cinematic smoke and sound, Tennant's shadow lingered, the man at the center who never sought to be seen. In the end, his legacy was not fame, but meaning. He had shown that leadership can exist without recognition, that greatness need not shout to be heard. His calm amid chaos, his refusal to abandon his post, his faith in the power of order over despair, these were not the traits of legend, but of character. And it is character, not spectacle, that endures when empires fall. Today, when the word Dunkirk is spoken, it conjures more than history. It evokes a feeling, a stubborn, almost sacred sense of endurance. It speaks of the power of unity in the face of disaster, of a small island refusing to kneel. It speaks of the moment when Britain, stripped of certainty, stood taller for having stood together. That is Tennant's true legacy, not a name carved into marble, but a spirit carried forward in the quiet resilience of a people who, in their darkest hour, remembered what it meant to be British. The tide still rolls across those northern beaches. The wooden mole is long gone, the sand smooth again, the horizon empty. But if you listen, above the wind and the surf, you can almost hear it, the hum of engines, the echo of footsteps, the murmur of men waiting to be saved. And somewhere, amid that fading sound, stands the outline of a man in naval blue, steady against the storm, watching the last ships fade into the mist. He died believing he had only done his duty, not knowing he had changed Britain forever.